Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on wherever you may be joining from. And welcome to this Quantum Pulse session that we conduct every month. We cover varied topics from deeply technical quantum physics related topics to topics that impact the industry. And today we have, and of course, policy related stuff as well. And today we have a very interesting and very pertinent topic. The focus is on responsible quantum. This topic is special for several reasons. The fact that we are having this discussion today in 2025 December is special because typically you would understand if you've been observing the industry in the AI space. While there were some conversations on AI that have been happening on responsible AI for a little longer, but the real impetus on this topic has come in very recently. And that sort of seems like a post facto situation. So when AI is already being deployed in a very big way across different kind of scenarios, we are now trying to look at how to use it responsibly after discovering how it has been used irresponsibly in certain cases, right? The beauty of having this conversation early on and the fact that there are people on this call who have been working in this area is that we are having this conversation right as the quantum science and technology is evolving. And this is a great time to be actually looking at the possibilities on what does it mean to use quantum responsibly. What does it mean? What does the term responsible mean, right? In the context of emerging technology, and how does it apply to quantum? What could be the various definitions of it? How does it apply to what we are doing? And what does it mean for the future? We are going to explore every aspect of it in today's conversation. And we are very fortunate to have people who are doing work in responsible technology, in responsible quantum. And, early on in the Quantum Pulse sessions, I realized that, if I were to do introductions for everybody, I would go all around the place in terms of being, doing the best introduction. So from the first session onwards, I have always asked the panelists to introduce themselves, especially in the context of the work that they're doing related to the topic that we are going to be discussing today. So my request to all of you, can you please introduce yourself, very brief introduction, and please give a little bit of context that you're doing with respect to the work that you're doing with respect to responsible quantum. So with that, Zeki, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. And well, first of all, thank you a lot for this invitation, and thanks to the other panelists for being here and the audience as well. So I'm Zeki. I'm currently a researcher in the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology at ETAS, the Institute for Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis in Germany. So my background is in physics. But then I followed with a science and technology policy studies program. So I usually joke that I'm a physicist by training, social scientist by choice. And yeah, we primarily work on like technology assessment for quantum technologies, which also includes like responsible technology development aspects, like ethical, legal, social aspects. We do some landscaping work, we do some policy, development work, and basically doing some, research on how to develop these technologies more responsibly. And also we organize a lot of events. So
Great, thank you
yeah,
so much.
thank
And
you.
Mohan, over to you.
Yep, thanks, Reena. Hello, everyone. My name is Mohan Barwal Chetri. I'm a principal research scientist at CSIRO, which is Australia's National Science Agency. And within CSIRO, I'm a member of the Cybersecurity and Quantum Systems group. So you sort of understand the area that we're working in, cybersecurity and quantum. More specifically, I'm sort of looking at the human-centric cybersecurity, looking at the intersection of humans, AI, emerging tech, and how that impacts cybersecurity. I guess in the context of my participation in this session, currently we are sort of involved in a project with Reina that's looking at developing foundational principles for responsible quantum innovation in the Asia Pacific region. So this is through funding from the DFAT, Australian government. Prior to that, I've sort of done some work within CSIRO looking at quantum readiness in Australia. So looking at how organizations are preparing themselves for the quantum future. We've also looked at the impact of quantum computing on cybersecurity and how professionals in the cybersecurity domain and in the quantum technology field uh, look at these risks and implications for the future. So I guess that's why I'm in this conversation. I guess just sort of going back to what Rina said at the introduction, with AI, sort of responsible AI being sort of like being forced upon us once the technology became mainstream. I think I'm also part of that bandwagon. I sort of do some work around responsible AI as well. So particularly looking at the use of frontier AI technologies in critical infrastructure. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Mohan. And Clarissa, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Rina, and thanks for the invitation. So my name is Clarissa Ailing Lee. You can call me Clarissa Lee. I am at Monash University, the Malaysian campus, at the School of Business there in the management department. So I actually kind of like Zaki, I also kind of started in physics, but unlike him, I did not do a PhD in physics. But I did do a PhD where I did work with physics, if that makes sense. So my PhD dissertation literally was looking at novelty and discovery in high energy particle physics. And I think from that time, I mean, when I was an undergrad, I've always been interested in quantum physics, but at that point in time, I didn't quite understand what quantum physics was as a physics major, which was ironic. And I was only came to quite understand more what quantum physics was when I was a humanities PhD, working on the intersection of philosophy, physics, as well as media studies as well. And I think from that point onwards, I've always been interested in looking at genealogies of technologies and genealogies of scientific knowledge, particularly in the physical sciences. Of course, that went all the way back to my former life as well. So, and I have actually directly been working. I've been indirectly working on issues relating to responsibility, even though it wasn't quantum in the beginning. I started actually, after my PhD, I went backwards and started looking at nuclear instead. I mean, I know it says kind of weird to say went backwards, but I kind of went back to the kind of like the starting point for all this, which was nuclear, right? For me, nuclear and quantum actually grew up at the same time, but the technologies reached maturity at a different point in time. So, and of course, coming from an emerging economy, that was also a very good starting point for me to really understand risk, understanding technological adoption, especially for technologies that are associated with high risk and which also are considered very black box by a lot of people. And let's say that's the same for quantum as well. And it's interestingly that because I'm in Malaysia right now, that I actually see a revival of interest in nuclear tech, as in like nuclear energy, around the same time as there's growing interest in quantum. So I don't think this is coincidental. And of course, like as what Mohan was just saying, right, AI actually has been that so-called emerging technology that actually has been emerging forever. I mean, it's emerging for past 100 years. But I think it came to fruition and became more popular and publicly visible because of Gen AI, obviously, right? And Gen AI has now got created new interest in general artificial intelligence, even though that was something that actually pre-existed Gen AI. And now we have conversations around conversational AI as well and then agentic AI. And of course, as Mohan was saying, there's quantum AI, right? So AI generates its own buzz, quantum creates its own hype, and then quantum AI will create its own. I'm not sure what it's going to look like at this point. It's going to look
Okay.
like a real Leviathan. Yeah, it's going to be called like a huge chimeric entity. So yeah, for instance, of responsible quantum tech, I came to it directly probably about 2 years ago, drawing from my previous work that I did actually on digital technologies, nuclear, and more recently, also looking at AI as well. But I'll say it actually started way back from my undergraduate days, and then went on to when I was doing my PhD and always wondering about how technologies transform, and not just transform it itself, but also transform society.
Sure. Thank you. So thank you for the introductions. I'm going to now jump into the questions. So while I don't know if there is a perfect definition for what is responsible quantum. And therefore, I'm going to ask each one of you to say, what does the term responsible quantum mean to you? And which aspect of responsibility is most important to you and your work? Right? Because there are many aspects to responsibility. Mohan and I are working on a framework, and we are realizing that responsible can have many definitions, and we are doing that definition, but we would love to know for the benefit of the audience. So for example, Zeki, would you tell us a little bit about what does responsible mean for you, and which aspect of responsibility you think is most important?
Yeah, thank you. So, as you said, there are many definitions, and also I kind of like I think that it's also good that it's a bit malleable, like we can play with it a little bit. So one definition I kind of like is Mira Bowens. She says it's responsible quantum computing means quantum computing that is aware of its power and consequences. It's good. Another one we use very like especially for presentations. It's like think about like there are those people who primarily focus on the benefits. There are those people who primarily focus on the risks. But like any technological development comes with benefits and risks, and benefits and risks are not distributed equally. So like there are certain groups might be impacted by certain benefits more. Certain groups might be impacted by certain harms more. So like responsible technology development basically means for us that being aware of all these, intricate and complex relationships, and trying to like create like this balanced approach between, risks, benefits, who gets the, benefit from it, who is, offloaded as risks of this development. And maybe one final thing is, especially from my side, I'm really interested in bottom-up approaches, but responsible technology development has both top-down and bottom-up approaches, and they need to be done simultaneously. So, like if you just focus on bottom-up, then at some point politics intervene, and then like all of your gains can be removed by certain policy decisions. But if you only focus on top-down, then you don't have the communities on your side, and you will have very like difficult time in implementing any of the solutions you come up with. So like I think it's both ways.
Great. So, since I have a question, I'll ask it right now. It's very relevant to ask it right now so that people remember it. You talked about bottom up and top down approaches. If I look at a bottom up approach, while you will have the community on your side, if you do that, there is also this whole possibility of having the community getting fragmented by different viewpoints, right? Because we've seen that happen in the past in different aspects of technology adoption. So, how do you do you think that is a significant challenge? And if yes, how are you addressing it, or how do you want to address it?
I mean, that's a very good point. And so one thing I think we need to accept that there will be different opinions and different approaches. And like I don't think it's realistic to expect like a consensus, like a community-wide consensus on what is right and what is not. But the really like the responsible approach is trying to like progress towards a relatively common good or common understanding, or like through a deliberation process, that even though we might not agree with everything with other people are doing in the community, like if we are more or less feeling that they are doing it from a more like responsible perspective, then I think we shouldn't try to stop each other, let's say, or to try to like come on the top. But yeah, this is a general issue with, especially with like deliberative democratic systems. Like there needs to be deliberation between different points of view and opinions, because that is also how you basically. Oh, we have a whiteboard. Cool. That is also how you basically understand what your approach is missing, because if you primarily focus on your approach and your normative structure and your ideas, then you can't really see your shortcomings.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And Clarissa, what is your definition of responsibility, given that you come from a very unique background and a different approach for responsible emerging tech, not just quantum? It would be great to hear from you as well.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Actually, this was the question I started asking myself a whole lot more when I started to work explicitly on quantum responsible quantum tech, because it actually got me thinking about all the work I've actually done before that have resonance of responsibility, but I've never actually framed them as such, right? Because I've always been interested in risk in technologies. So when I talk about risk, right, what is the responsibility around risk and who holds the responsibility around risk? So responsibility, and I remember because recently, actually about 3 months ago, wow, I can't believe it's actually more than 3 months ago now. It's almost 6 months ago when I actually did a training for a hackathon where I have to bring responsible quantum tech as a module for the participants. And I remember I was doing it with somebody else, and I remember the sort of struggle I had trying to figure out what to put into that module, because I realized that because people who work in the area come from very many different disciplines, right? So if you ask philosopher ethicists, they will have a very different idea of what responsibility is, and I think Zaki already partially answered that, the definition for that. And if you're actually asking a person who is doing policy, they will also have a very different idea of what responsibility is, because their idea is not so much about what is responsibility, but who are they responsible to, right? And then if you're actually asking a scientist, and I do work quite closely with scientists. In fact, recently I was involved with um I don't want to say too much because it's still not yet announced. I was involved with the development of a project with some physicists. And for them, the idea of responsibility, yes, is ethics, but it's also more about how would their work impact society. And however way you want to phrase that impact is literally for them, it's just semantic, right? They don't really care, but they do care about what it means for, you know, what it means for the long-term impact of their work in terms of funding they will get, as well in terms of how the public and those who are not from within the, let's say, quantum community, how will they receive that work? So that is also another form of responsibility as well, in sense of caring about public perception and also caring about the impact and receptivity of one's work on the public. So that's that. And of course, a lot of this goes back also to values and beliefs, right? So, for instance, there are people who believe that technology should only have a particular role in society and should not exceed that role. Whereas there are others who may decide that let's see what happens. Let's not constrain what technology can do. I mean, recently, Donald Trump issued an executive order to, in a way, suppress the possibility of 50 states from having anything to say about development of AI, right? So, and we wonder what that will actually also mean when it comes to quantum. And do we actually put this in the same category or in the same level when we talk about, oh, what does that mean for responsibility in AI when there is such an executive order? Whereas in quantum, yes, there are people who are looking at regulations, looking at legislation, looking at policies already at this point, and there are discussions at higher level. But in terms of how is that even supposed to look like for them, they don't really know yet, because a lot of legislations around AI were retroactive. They were done after the fact, right? When they have an idea how it's going to look like and what the impact is. Whereas the quantum, there's an attempt to do a preemptive strike. But it's also a little bit difficult because I would say there's also a lot of secrecy around developments of quantum tech, probably way more than AI, because it's so driven a lot by governments and the military, right? I mean, both particular fields of technology have their own forms of secrecy and confidentiality, but operating in a very different way. So
Right.
then we have export controls, which is supposed to be a form of responsibility, but then by enacting that, right, as supposed safeguards, how are we responsible to the people who then lose access
Right.
to the knowledge?
Sure.
So
So,
yeah, so
Clarissa,
these
I'll
are,
come back to you. I think I'll
yeah,
come back to you because those are interesting topics. They are more deep dive topics, so we'll come back to those. And I
yeah.
think you described a whole range of responsibilities, and I think what you brought forward is a very important aspect of what does it mean for each stakeholder, and it really looks very different for each stakeholder, and especially when people are specialists in certain areas, their view tends to be very focused, very myopic from that perspective. And I think that creates so many different perspectives of what responsibility can mean. And I think Zeki earlier talked about this top down and bottom up approach, and this is a perfect time to now bring in Mohan, because the project that is being worked upon, which CSIRO and QETCI are working together, and maybe Mohan, you can talk about this top down approach that is there in this, or whatever perspective we want to bring in on the various aspects of responsibility that a framework could have in this case, right? What does it mean for you and this project?
So maybe just before you talk about our project, I'll talk a little bit about responsible quantum and maybe one step back, responsible innovation in general.
Sure.
And within CSIRO, we've actually recently finished a strategic multi-year initiative called the Responsible Innovation Future Science Platform. And the primary sort of reason behind that multi-year initiative was that as Australia's national science agency, we are sort of working at the forefront of emerging research technologies. And we are sort of solving some of the biggest challenges that Australia faces as a country. So, we're sort of looking at food security, we're looking at clean energy, we're looking at health and how we sort of use science to improve health. How do you build resilient environments? And ultimately, how do you sort of secure the country and the region, right? And so essentially, all the work that we do and all the future science and technology that we deal with, the objective is to deliver something that benefits society as a whole. So responsible innovation is delivering socially responsible science and technology that creates a better future for everyone. I think and so that can then be applied to the responsible AI, responsible cyber, responsible quantum, responsible something else, right? Now, so that's the sort of I guess, the view that CSIRO takes as a whole on this whole notion of responsible innovation. So, and what's important, I guess, with response innovation is that it's a participatory process. You involve all the stakeholders. You sort of include them in the decision making. It's not sort of, certain stakeholders make all the decisions and then the others have to agree with it. And so when you sort of innovate responsibility, there's the opportunity for all stakeholders to participate in this process. So this can be the technology developers, the end users, the policymakers, research and academics. So all of the general communities, so all of them can understand what are the potential impacts of the technology that's being developed, and then influence how it can help shape the future. And this applies quite nicely with quantum, where if you sort of think about the innovation cycle, I think we are still at that stage where we have the opportunity to influence decisions, because quantum, particularly quantum computing, is still not yet mainstream technology. And so, we can sort of learn lessons from what we did with AI, where the technology became mainstream overnight and people are scrambling to try to figure out how to use the technology responsibly. Whereas with quantum, we have that opportunity where we can start thinking about what are the benefits of quantum, what are the risks associated with quantum, how is it going to impact society? How can we use it to benefit society, and how can we sort of, I guess, to some extent, prevent the negative impacts of the technology? Now, coming back to the project that we're currently working on, which is sort of, I guess you sort of say this is the top-down approach, where what we're doing essentially, and I guess for the benefit of the listeners, we are sort of looking at the work that's happening across the globe, I guess, around responsible quantum, looking at what are the different approaches that other researchers who are working in the space are doing around responsible quantum, trying to learn or trying to sort of get all the good points of those approaches and sort of put them together and create this new framework that can benefit the region as a whole. But then I think when you talk about sensitive technologies like quantum, you just don't look at, okay, these are I guess, the advantages, these are the disadvantages. You also sort of look at the regional context. And there's different sort of factors that come into play when you think about, the Asia Pacific region. You've got different players, you've got different groups of, I guess, groups of countries that work together. So you've got sort of the geopolitical sort of considerations. You've got the size of the economies involved, and so all of these have to be taken into consideration to make sure that the benefits are shared across all nations, but then at the same time, you want to make sure that countries work in ways in ways that can sort of I guess develop the technology, but do so in a responsible way. And so what we're doing in this project, we sort of developing a framework essentially which is driven by values. So values that we want to sort of achieve as a nation, as a society, as a group of nations, as a region. And then we sort of try to map those values into sort of principles and concrete actions. And these actions can then be sort of attributed to the different stakeholders in the quantum ecosystem. And of course, then we sort of apply that regional sort of lens to sort of decide, okay, which actions are appropriate for which collectives of countries. And then, so the idea is then once you sort of come up with this framework, we then sort of present this to the different stakeholders to get their feedback on it. And so currently what we're doing is you're sort of drafting that framework and you sort of got a version of it ready. Once that's sort of more stable and mature, then the idea is to sort of then take this to the relevant stakeholders, both in Australia and in India, and get their feedback on what we've proposed. And then based on that feedback, we're then sort of going to refine this framework. And hopefully we sort of do this iteratively, and then at some point we make this available for everyone to sort of use and extend and work on. Yep. So
And
I
we'll
guess
also
that's
be taking feedback from stakeholders from outside these two countries.
outside. Yes.
Yes. So we are
Thank,
most
thank you.
likely to get
Thank you
back
very
to
much.
our fellow panelists also for their viewpoints. That is
Yep.
very likely to happen soon. Yeah. Thank you. So I think once we've, sort of thrashed around the definition of responsible quantum, and Mohan, you mentioned the quantum ecosystem, right? You just brought up the concept of the ecosystem. And I think since this is a nascent and evolving technology area and evolving very, very rapidly, and there is differences in how progress is happening in different parts of the world, also in terms of the kind of investment that is happening in different parts of the world. So this is a question open to all of you. uh, One of you or all of you can answer this. Is what is your comment on the state of the quantum ecosystem and its stages? At what stage is the ecosystem? How is it different across the world? And how does that impact us when we try to have a global conversation on responsible quantum?
Anybody wants to take this?
Anybody?
Okay.
You can go first.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, it depends because like right now, I mean, there's an issue that goes beyond quantum, right? Because like we are going through this relative period of deglobalization according to some, or a reshifting of globalization according to others. So like building on that, we don't really know what will happen in the next 20 years. Will there still be a relatively free trade order? Will there be more protectionism? What will be its impact on technology development, especially on higher added value stuff? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty that's going on. And this is not a quantum issue. This is not an AI issue. That's a general geopolitical issue. Within that, I think in the quantum field there are two main trends. One is there's huge public support because there's an expectation that it will bring some economic prosperity, and it will create jobs, it will create higher value added products. And the second is there's this general fear of missing out, but not only on the economic aspect, but there's a lot of expectation that these are new technologies, these are powerful technologies, there will definitely be something for cybersecurity, there will definitely be something for in the sensing field, in warfare, in infrastructure defense, those kind of things. And I mean there's a bit hype around those things, because like if you actually do the technical analysis, it's not going to be super revolutionary, at least in the near term. But there's also a lot of truth in that, because like we don't really know what will these technologies lead to, because these are they're opening up technological opportunity spaces, and we will maybe be able to explore them, maybe not, depending on our luck and R&D infrastructures. But yeah, I think like the general two trends are like there's this economic perspective and there's this more security and national capability or sovereignty perspective. And like anyone who is doing responsible quantum needs to acknowledge both of them. And sometimes they come up with like conflicting policy recommendations, let's say. And like this is what Mohammed was saying, like you have to be participatory and open to all the stakeholders and work on deliberating between, I don't know, the priorities of the security stakeholders versus the industry stakeholders versus the civil society.
Sure, sure. Any other thoughts on this?
I can probably comment on this and sort of more sort of presenting the view within Australia. I think in Australia, we have quite a vibrant quantum ecosystem, I would say. So I think Australia has been on the front foot in terms of releasing the National Quantum Strategy in 2023, explicitly capturing responsible and inclusive development as one of the core themes in the strategy. So if you look at the strategy, I think theme 5 is basically around inclusive development. And one of the action items they've listed there is the development of principles for responsible and inclusive development and adoption of quantum technology. So which aligns very nicely with the project that we're working on. Uh, and then, so obviously, so you've got the government that's sort of quite active in promoting research and innovation in the quantum space. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this, but the Australian government has invested quite heavily in a company called PsiQuantum, close to $1 billion, and with the hope that they'll sort of develop the first commercial quantum computer. So there's big investment there. There's a lot of startups based in Australia that are looking at the different quantum technologies. I think from a research perspective, the Australian Research Council funds quite heavily a lot of research into quantum technologies. Now, CSIRO itself is quite actively working in the space. So obviously, I sort of look at the responsible angle of quantum, but then there are other sort of researchers within my group and across other sort of research units that look at developing the technology itself, both for example, in quantum sensing, we do a lot of work. With quantum computing, we're sort of looking at quantum machine learning. So I think Clarissa mentioned quantum plus AI. So that's something that we look at as well. Our focus is on cybersecurity, which means that we are looking at sort of post-quantum crypto. So that's a big deal. Although sort of not directly sort of on the working on the technology, but I think PQC is quite active. In Australia, the official recommendation is that organizations migrate to post-quantum crypto by 2030. So we've actually set a deadline for that. I think Quantum Australia is like the organization that's responsible for bringing together the different stakeholders in the Australian quantum ecosystem. So they play quite an active role in bringing together government, academia, industry. So we have the annual Quantum Australia conference that's been running for the past 3-4 years. We've got sort of I guess government funded sort of initiatives. For example, the project that we are working on that's between Australia and India. We've got sort of similar arrangements with Singapore. I think we're starting to sort of do that with South Korea and Japan. So basically, there's a lot of activity that's happening around quantum. So I think from that perspective, I would say that it's very vibrant. And I would say it's one of the rapidly maturing ecosystems across the world. But then I think in terms of the, I guess, size, Australia is still not a major player, right? So we are still sort of relying on some of the bigger players to sort of do the development, but I think we are punching above our weight. So I would say we've got a very vibrant quantum ecosystem.
So maybe I could add, because as the ecosystem player entity, we sort of keep track of ecosystems. So for the benefit of the audience, we could say that, if you really want to look at the global picture, I think the US and China These are the two countries which have full supply chains or a very big portion of the supply chains within their own countries, right? Otherwise, the rest of the world is part of the global supply chain or the global value chain in some format. Europe is, of course, a cohesion combination of different nations. So there you can see a lot of elements of the supply chain also coming in as a European Union. But then India also, all the G7 countries definitely are doing something or the other in this space. If you look at bilateral and multilateral groups like Quad or the G7 or or NATO, you look at any combination, whether it is Asia Pacific or the world, there is quantum is on the strategic agenda of all of them. So if just by this definition you can make out that there is a whole lot of development that is happening in all the ecosystems. India also has a national quantum mission, and there are 4 hubs that have been announced. Funding has been released, development is happening. And India has committed, the national mission is committed 1 billion USD just for research and development, and there's a whole lot of money that is coming in from the private sector and the investment companies and so on. It is a newer ecosystem compared to the rest of the world, like the Western countries, especially India started. There was a lot of background research work that has been happening for years, but then the real impetus and focus came in just 4 years ago. So it's interesting that one of our companies recently closed Series A funding for 32 million USD, which is at par almost with the rest of the world for Series A funding for quantum, right? So I think that way the ecosystem is moving forward in a very fast way. In terms of responsible quantum, we seem to be doing the first project along with CSIRO. But having said that, if you look at our National Quantum Mission, or you look at the National Roadmap for Quantum, which is prepared by Niti Aayog, or if you look at the state level strategy documents, almost all of them talk about responsible and ethical use of quantum. So the policy framework has been set, or the policy intent has been set, frameworks are being developed right now. So I feel that, unlike AI, I think this conversation in India also is happening way early compared to AI, and that seems like a positive sign. Having said that, I find that the topic is a little too complex. And I'm an engineer and I like to break down systems to their smallest level so that I can understand how is it going to be implemented. And that's where it really bothers me. And I think these systems tend to break down. And it's not true just for quantum. I think one of the challenges we have to solve in all of the technology, responsible technology discourse is, yes, strategy is great, guidelines, recommendations are great, but why does implementation break down? Do we miss the understanding of stakeholders? Do we miss out on how implementation needs to happen and so on, right? So in fact, in line with this, maybe I'm going to ask the next question.
Actually, I will actually have just one quick comment
Yeah, sure.
regarding the ecosystem is just to complement what Zaki and Mohan has said. Because I'm in the business school, so obviously I'm also watching the business ecosystem. And it's very interesting that within the business world, a lot of the fears or even focus is actually around this idea of the Q day. And Q day is actually associated with quantum security. Actually, it's not even the whole range of quantum, but it's about quantum security. And there's a lot of these conversations tend to kind of circulate around, but no one actually quite know what exactly is this Q day. It's similar to, when people were talking about the millennium, right? 2000 and what was going to happen, the clock's going to go to zero and everything is going to be a disaster. And I think this same kind of fear mongering is actually happening a lot in the finance circle. I was recently in a fintech festival in Singapore and there were like a lot of talks around quantum. I didn't attend all of them, but I attended a few, and a lot of the conversations circle around this same idea of the Q day. And in terms of like the quantum startup system, there is actually a quantum startup ecosystem, but there's also a lot of quantum hype startup ecosystem in the sense that there are companies that use the hype on quantum to not to say to pretend, but to kind of hype out what they do when they're actually not really quite doing anything. And even for emerging technology, I would say quantum is still pretty much at the incremental stage. So if you actually look at a lot of the papers that are published, I do that a lot because of the work that I'm actually doing right now, trying to, for instance, looking at how quantum is used to solve so-called wicked problems in sustainability, right? It's like particularly in energy and climate. A lot of the publications around these issues are pretty much incremental. Not to say that incremental is bad, but it actually also points to the fact that there's no real major breakthrough at this point in time. So, and I would say that within there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of not to say fear, but anxiety, and there's also a lot of future talking when it comes to quantum, all right, within in the business space and also in the policy space. But I kind of feel that a lot of it actually sometimes circle around around ignorance way more than actually about what's really happening. Yeah, just wanted to say that.
Okay, sure. I think there is a two. Now you've introduced a debatable topic, so we're going to debate on it. Because I'm right now in Mumbai, and just before this meeting, in the morning, I was actually talking to a group of CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, from the banking and financial services and insurance sector. And the conversation that I was telling them was, is that when people say that it's a myth, that this is a hype or it's a myth, actually we do disservice. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that. In order to understand the impact of D-Day, even if it is whether it is 5 years from now or 10 years from now, there is a concept called risk exposure, which is used by insurance people and people who do risk management. And that term actually means that risk exposure is, the higher the risk exposure, the more you need to act on it, the more the urgency to act on it. And risk exposure is actually equal to the probability of the risk happening multiplied by the impact of the risk. So even if your probability is 10% in the next 2 years or 3 years, and the probability becomes 80% only in 10 years' time, the impact usually for every nation, if you include all its industries, all its critical infrastructure of the D-Day happening, is in trillions of dollars. So that means that the risk exposure is extremely high. And decisions for, so the question is, when we're talking about whole sectors, whole industries, there is a lot of confusion in the ecosystem which comes in because people sometimes just think of the perspective, is this really likely to happen in the next 2 years or 5 years? But the conversation that needs to happen is about the risk exposure. And if the risk exposure is already high, even if it's a 10% probability, that means that there is a need to invest in it and actually act paranoid about it, right? So this is where I think your views and my views are slightly different on it. And I'm one of those people who does the fear mongering, by the way, for this, because I'm very worried about it. And I look at this, I have done the calculation for the risk exposure for a nation like India, and I think the same is true for every nation. Similarly, if a company does a calculation of the risk exposure that they have, then the board is more likely to, sort of understand the kind of investment that needs to be made here. By the way, this is a perfect example of what we mean by responsible quantum and how, Zeki, opinions may be different on the ground. So if you take an academician and you take a person who comes from the business side, right? I am a technical person, but I have spent a way lot more time talking to boards and, looking at the risk management from a board perspective and what does it mean for nations and stuff like that. So we will see a difference in opinion, right? And for me, responsibility in this conversation is about taking a stand and investing in this. And I think from Clarissa's point of view, it's being irresponsible to fearmonger, right? So, and this is exactly how the ecosystem is right now. There is a variety of different opinions and a variety of different perceptions on what we should be doing and what we should not be doing. So I'm so glad, Clarissa, we are having this conversation because it really brings out the point of how there are differences in opinion. So in this environment, how do we reach a conclusion? And especially since, Zeki, you are working with communities, right? How do you drive consensus? And is there a single litmus of truth, right? Is there a litmus test for truth? How do we sort of go ahead and create more consensus in this space? I see this as one of the major challenges. I mean, just for an example, I was in a Delhi Defense Dialogue, and I was talking about what does it mean for defense sector, quantum. And right after me, a gentleman comes in and says, actually, quantum is hype. And then the next day, the US Department of War actually comes out is with 6 focus technologies which they are going to prioritize, which one of them is quantum battlefield intelligence, right? So now, what is to you having? So it's very interesting how this plays out on a daily basis. Over to you.
Yeah, this has been a great example, and I think you're both right in the sense that there is a lot of people. There's a lot of people who hype. Like they basically there are people who lie, and just say, oh, in 2 years we will have this. Maybe there's already a quantum computer. Like no, but also there are people who are, I would say, overly cautious, especially on the academic side. They basically say things like, oh, yeah, this is 20 years away, or this is 30 years away. And this concept like skin in the game. So like if you're an academic and you want more research funding, then you don't really care what happens in 5 years that much. But if you want to sell your products, then overhype. So one thing that I would advocate for is just be aware of people's context and like their situations and like not just what is being said, but who is saying that and what are their like conditions for saying that. And on that front, like there's like that's also why I kind of push for like having a diversity of opinions. Because like when we were analyzing this Y2K issue, like the 2000 issue, like there are estimates that around 400 billion US dollars were spent on mitigating the risk, and maybe we could have just spent 80 billion. So like, that's quite a difference. But then when you speak with people who were like cybersecurity experts back then, their main argument is we didn't know what would be the actual impact, and we still don't know. This is a counterfactual. Like you cannot just say that, oh yeah, we should have spent only 80 billion because like 400 was overshot. But you don't know what would be the real impact. And like recently we have seen with like this Cloudflare issue or this Microsoft update issue, like when something in the cybersecurity chain actually breaks, it has a lot of impact. So, I mean, of course, we shouldn't advocate for very expensive and sometimes unnecessary solutions for everyone. But in certain aspects, like we need to be like I'm definitely against fear mongering, but I am for risk assessment. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, all right. Any thoughts on that, Mohan?
Maybe just to add to the conversation. So I think, like I said, we sort of recently completed a study on quantum readiness. And the reports section are publicly available. And essentially, what we did in that study was it's multi-stage. So first stage, what we did was we sort of did uh, a landscape analysis. We're sort of trying to do a mapping exercise. You've got the sort of the main quantum technologies. You've got quantum computing, sensing, communication, and then you've got the different sort of sectors. And so it's sort of looking in the Australian context. And you're sort of trying to say, okay, based on the publicly available literature, white literature, gray literature, market studies, industry reports, we sort of say, okay, what are all the sort of different use cases that have been put out in the public domain by the different stakeholders? And how do they map to the different sectors? So we sort of did this mapping exercise. And what we observed was that most of the use cases were coming from the technology developers and the ones who sort of resell the technology. And there were sort of fewer studies coming from the actual end users of the technology. Right. So that was based on the sort of the literature analysis. And then we sort of did the interviews and a survey as well. And even there, one of the things that sort of stood out as one of the main sort of deterrents for investing too much into quantum was that organizations are still trying to figure out, okay, what's the main application of quantum tech for my organization,
Right.
right? And so they're saying unless there's something concrete or tangible, it doesn't make sense. There are other competing priorities where I need to invest money. And so
True.
there is a bit of a mismatch in terms of what the end users are expecting, what the technology developers, the technology providers are talking about, and which I think is normal. One selling and the other is buying.
Right.
So the seller is going to hype the product, and the buyers are going to be more cautious, right? And then you've got the sort of the third, I guess, the third key stakeholder in this sort of ecosystem is the government. I think from an Australian perspective, quantum technology is one of the critical technologies. So the government has sort of identified that as a critical technology that's that the government should invest in, and so they're sort of all in a sense. But then I think they've sort of done the right thing in terms of sort of setting up the strategy and sort of having the sort of I guess the boundaries set and say, okay, these are the responsibilities of the different stakeholders. This is what we should be doing. This is our next 5-year plan, 10-year plan. So at least that's sort of laid out, and so all the players know what the roles are. Right.
Mhm.
But in terms of matching the hype and the expectations, I think it's not just with quantum. I think it's with any technology. The only difference is that with quantum, maybe because we see this as a major disruptive technology, there's more hype and more sort of reservations. But the other thing I think we probably want to talk about is with all the use cases, we found that quantum computing has had the most number of potential use cases, but that's the technology that's got, in terms of maturity, we still don't know when that's going to happen. I think quantum sensing is a lot more mature technology, but then
Absolutely.
the hype around that is a lot less. But
Right.
that's where I guess the end users actually have more concrete use cases. So this is something I think. So this is where the different stakeholders have different perspectives, and they're in different stages of their thinking around quantum technology adoption and use. And this is something that I think, somehow this needs to be balanced. I guess there needs to be a way in which all the different stakeholders can come together and have sort of reach an agreement on how they should move forward.
Right.
And sort of taking this responsible approach is one way of bringing the different stakeholders together.
I think so. I actually feel from what you just said and what Zeki said is that that's why entities like QETCI, people who are don't have a vested interest in on either side but are responsible for the ecosystem actually have a role to play. And one of the things which really strikes me is that in the last 1.5 years we've been focusing on quantum sensing in a big way. Why? Because we wanted to uplevel the conversation in that space, precisely for the reason that you said. That this was something which is near term. It's happening right now. There are more use cases, and it has been very easy to get the end user to have conversations
Yeah.
with the people who are developing the technology, so that fast track development can happen, right? And so we've been driving the conversation. So this is the role that ecosystem entities can do, is to actually catalyze the ecosystem in areas which are more likely to be useful for everyone, right, in the near term or in the midterm and things like that. And I think the responsibility that does come up for the vendors, especially on the computing side, like you said, is that because many of these algorithms are so far off, right? I mean, in terms of the availability of actual qubits to be able to implement them, then when you compare that with the amount of flooding that has happened on teaching people uh, algorithmic development on their proprietary technology that the vendors are doing right now, and if you majority of the work across the world is happening on computing, and it is being driven by the computing vendors, and they flood the market by telling people you should learn this language and you should develop on top of it because this will make you an expert. And then they will come and say, oh, India has like 100,000 people who are trained in this technology. Not one of them is hireable, by the way, anywhere. Because right now the ecosystem needs people who can work on sensors. So I need these guys to be electronic engineers who also understand quantum. So, of course, the government has now introduced minor programs across in the and across undergrad programs where combinations can be taken by people to fill this gap, right? But in the industry, people are filling the gap themselves. They are, coming from the electronic side, and they're going ahead and doing special courses on quantum, and then they're learning on the job, and this is how things are proceeding. But the view that is being sold by the quantum computing vendors is an irresponsible view, if I can use the term, or not so responsible view in terms of what it means in the short term, medium term, and the long term. And I think this is the discrepancy that you guys were pointing out from a slightly different perspective in terms of availability of qubits and so on, right? So I think entities which are neutral, entities which can, sort of work with all the stakeholders, can definitely bridge the gap in many cases to, sort of get people to speak the same language when they sit in the same room, and make sure that anything which is too hyped, etc., can be, sort of brought to a level playing field in the conversation. Yes, Zeki, and I think the question I have in mind before you speak is that even in that scenario, talking about responsible quantum in terms of ethical quantum is a whole different nuance, right? So please say what you have to say, and then we want to talk a little bit about what does ethical quantum mean.
Yeah, thanks. And so I just want to build up on what you said. So in the field of technology assessment in general, like SDS as well, we use the term honest broker. So basically acting as an honest broker between different stakeholder groups. But also it is quite, I mean, at least for me, it is quite important to not frame oneself as a neutral actor, but also do some self-reflexive assessment of, okay, what is our role within the ecosystem? Because we have a role in the ecosystem. So like we are not, people who are coming from outside and trying to, just make it responsible or something. So like I'm not sure, like neutral, like especially from an SDS point of view, neutral has some not really great connotations, let's say. So like, an honest broker,
Okay,
like
okay.
like an
So by
actor that
neutral,
brings,
right, by neutral, I mean not having leanings towards the interest of any
yeah,
single
yeah.
party. That's what I
But we
meant,
also
right?
have our own interests, right? So
Which
like,
is, yeah, of course.
yeah,
Our interest is the ecosystem. Ideally, that's what it should be now.
yeah.
Because if you look at our mission statement, it is to enable and accelerate the quantum ecosystem in a particular region, right? Now, within that region, the various stakeholders have different interests. So when I said neutral, our role theoretically is supposed to be not leaning towards any one type of stakeholder, but look at the interests of all of them. Having said that, we are all human beings, and how do prejudices come into picture, and the psychology of it all will obviously open up a lot of other questions. But I just meant it in that context. But I like the definition that you talked about, the honest broker. I think that is probably a good way to call it out. That should be the aim. I agree.
Yeah, it's not my word. It's very common. Like there's a book about it. Like it's a very common thing in the policy, world.
Sure. So now coming to ethical quantum, whenever we are talking about responsible or ethical quantum, for any dual use technology, all the harmful usage actually happens in the when the dual use comes into the picture, right? Which is, the military applications of it. However, when we are discussing responsible quantum across the world, the conversation is only happening by the rest of the stakeholders, right? So isn't this a little bit of an ironical situation? And how can we really say that we are focusing on responsible technology if the conversation does not even go towards the military applications?
I mean, maybe I can start because like I kind of disagree that because these discussions are also happening in the military domain as well. Like I just left a NATO STO meeting to come here, and then I will go back there after this panel. So these are happening, but what we understand from ethical is a bit different in the defense and security domain. And I know this is being recorded, but just let me give you an example. At one of the discussions with like there was a Ukrainian delegation, and we were discussing about these topics, and then somebody from their side said, "Oh, ethics gets you killed." So then you can discuss, okay, is it really the case? Like, should we be so pacifist that at some point you don't have the weapons and the other side do, and then like you suffer for it? So like this is again a discussion on the NATO in terms of like the values. So like it's not that the militaries don't have values. They have values, but they're a bit differently understood from an academic perspective. That's why I kind of tried to emphasize on the previous comment I made about like, they are also stakeholders, like the
They are.
security stakeholders. Yeah, we should include them, but we should be very vigilant against securitization, because securitization is basically when the priorities of the security stakeholders just become, overly dominant over priorities of everyone else, which shouldn't happen, because security is, although it's a very important value and it's a very important thing to have, it's just one of the things we should aspire to. So it's like there should be, prosperity, there should be safety, there should be like the values that you also discussed in your project as well. Like there's a bunch of values, and you cannot just focus on security. So that I think in terms of like ethical, responsible quantum, the military and dual use side comes from there. Like we on the academic side, we need to acknowledge that they are very legitimate actors, but they also need to acknowledge that they are not the primary actors of these discussions.
Which is true. I think at a theoretical perspective, that makes perfect sense, and I totally agree with you. But if we look at the way the wars have been panning out, what has been happening in the rest of the world, right? For the first time, we are in a situation where the battlefield is civilian areas, right? Like, and so many civilian casualties are happening on a regular basis. Where is the conversation on ethics going to land us anyway? And I think it is. So we can have a theoretical discourse, but the way things are happening, there is seems to be a gap between the realities that the world is experiencing and this theoretical conversation on responsible use of technology, right? And honest brokers need to be powerful, honest brokers. They should have influence. They should be powerful, influential, honest brokers. In the international arena, there are no powerful, honest brokers left any longer, right? I mean, there are so-called broker entities which don't hold any power any longer, right? So I think maybe what the conclusion I can draw from this is that the shape and size or the makeup of these brokers in the international arena has to look different for any real conversation to really happen on the responsible use of technology in the security space. Would you agree with that?
I actually have something to add to the dual use since we're on the point on securitization, because I've been looking at dual use for quite a while. As I say, I started my career as an academic actually looking at nuclear technologies in the civilian use of nuclear technologies, right? And of course, I was also looking at the attempt to adopt nuclear energy in emerging economies, and how a lot of these are usually accompanied by discourse around dual use, right? And then the idea of non-proliferation, all this actually borrowed from the Cold War era, and also borrow very heavily from presumption of what is securitization, which is also itself its own theory in political science and IR, if you want to go that route, which also has a sort of like a very Eurocentric perspective as well. So, and I feel even dual use itself is actually came out from this binary understanding of the good actor versus the bad actor. But the question is, who is the bad actor? Who exactly is a good actor? Because I don't think this sort of binary can actually, I mean, this sort of black and white actually really exists in reality, because a good actor can also be the bad actor depending on whose context are we looking at this from. And I think there's also actually already a crazy number of work in literature that is also pushing back against this framing of dual use when it comes to looking at emerging technology, particularly for quantum, because it's a little bit too binary. And for instance, if we were to disallow, for instance, certain number of qubits of computers to reach certain groups of people, right? It itself does not prevent the idea of dual use within this whole safeguard Cold War discourse in itself. But what it actually does is that it does hamper access and also hamper one's ability to kind of work with the technology creatively and also responsibly, because the idea of dual use and safeguarding itself already attempts to it's already actually it actually comes from the perspective of distrust, that you do not trust the other person, you do not trust the other party, and so you want to preempt whatever harm you think they're doing, right? But the thing is that we never really have those conversations as to what the harm actually looks like and what exactly is the harm. It's
I
a lot
agree
of
with
this
you.
are hypothetical, and so a lot of it's also very theoretical, and a lot of it's also premised on certain policymakers who have like a probably high level view of the world, seeing things that are disaggregated from the ground, and for them, they view harm as such, which is very different from what the public and the civilian actually will view harm as. So I feel like we need to have a different vocabulary for talking about security rather than the usual dual use safeguard approach. This is something that I actually had brought up actually much earlier last year because I feel like the old Cold War vocabulary itself, even taking into consideration military interest in quantum tech itself, actually does a disservice to firstly the technology and also to the possibilities of the technology. And the difference I think between quantum and nuclear or even AI is that there's actually a lot of activism on the ground, right? And activism itself comes from different groups of people, which include also the physicists themselves and the technologies themselves, who actually want to have a more open approach to understanding the technology because for them, a transparent approach actually is one of the best way to cultivate against harm.
Which is what the cybersecurity domain does, because there we seem to have a lot more collaboration. Of course, there is hidden agendas as well, but then there is so much collaboration happening when it comes to cybersecurity across the world that, and there is a lot of openness that comes in that space, which we do not see in any of the other technologies, because that probably happens that while cybersecurity is also being weaponized, it is never really talked about as a dual use technology. And I totally agree with you on the fact that it's not a binary problem. And the more important thing is that there is no conversation that is happening on what is the conversation on the other side, on the so-called dual use, is not really being spread out because it makes people uncomfortable. But the moment you start having conversations, solutions are likely to emerge. I feel that that is the responsible way to look at it, to have that conversation. The other angle which I got from what you were saying is that when we look at dual use of technology, policymakers who look at it from a very high level perspective, they tend to create more of these, what should I say, these export controls on stuff which should not even be under export control. And there is a lot of opportunity for collaboration, for openness in this space. But almost everything that, even if it remotely seems like under the category of so-called dual use, completely the entire supply chain gets into this whole export control basis, and it actually hinders the development of technology. It hinders academic and research collaboration as well as other forms of collaboration between companies to fast track this technology so that it is more easily available to people for a lot of other use cases which are for the benefit of mankind overall, right? So we've spoken a lot on this, Mohan. You've been listening very carefully on this, and I'm also thinking that there's so much for us to take forward. We'll need a decoding session between our teams to actually leverage all of this. But what are your thoughts right now on some of these aspects of responsibility?
I think I'm just trying to think of what's the best way to phrase the response. So one view is I think defense is one of the end users of the technology. So similar to the different sectors like manufacturing and telecoms and defense is also a sector, and so I think they have their own use cases, and there are conversations happening between the technology developers and the technology users. Defense does fund a fair bit of research in this space. So I think, and I guess sort of if you apply the responsible innovation lens, I think defense will probably say that security is one of the most responsible, one of the values that they're looking at. And so what's a value that, so I guess depending upon the different stakeholders probably rate different values differently. So for them, for defense, security is more priority, whereas maybe for other stakeholders, inclusivity and equity and equal access to technology might be a priority for other stakeholders. And at the end of the day, I think uh, it's finding the right balance. Because especially these days, when you talk about, having sovereign technology and ensuring security in the sort of, competitive and world, I think the finding the right balance, it's not easy. And I think a lot of and even within, I think within countries, you have different views on this. You have activism at the ground level, people opposing certain ideas, other people supporting it. But that's, I think, it's not just related to quantum. I think it's related to any sort of disruptive technology, and the quantum is no exclusion. But I think at the end of the day, uh, as long for me, I think as a researcher, I sort of take the view that the primary benefit has to be for society. So anything that you do has to improve quality of life, right? And so if the solutions you are developing that contribute to that, then I think you sort of it's a major sort of tick for me. But then at the same time, I think it's uh, undeniable that security is a concern. It's a growing concern. I think, Reena, you talked about more, greater collaboration in cybersecurity, but I think you sort of read the conversations happening in the defense sector, then cyber is the fifth domain these days.
Yes, it is.
Right,
Yeah.
it is. So I think even in cyber, now you sort of need to think about who you're collaborating with. You can't just freely exchange ideas, right? So I think we are moving towards that whether we like it or not, right? And I think, yeah, so it's something that we have to just deal with. And again, I think, yeah, probably they have sort of brighter minds than us who are sort of thinking about these sort of problems with serious implications for the world.
I don't know about that. It's not a question of brighter minds, I guess. So, because what I've noticed is that conversation has to start everywhere. Like Zeki said, it is top down as well as bottom up. So, somewhere, if we are in the middle, we also should be having this conversation. And who knows what conversations spark what ideas, right? And also, some of these conversations, for example, are giving me insight into the project that we are doing, right? In terms of how stakeholder views are going to emerge. There are some new understanding that is getting built. So that is going to be very useful for us, and some of the challenges which we are going to face when we do stakeholder consultation are becoming very obvious to me now, right? Because of the different kind of viewpoints that are going to come
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
towards us. Yeah. Um, uh, let's talk about implementation. When How is responsible frameworks going to percolate down? For example, when I look at AI, uh, so there is this whole concept of that AI should be transparent, right? You should know what the AI system is doing, where is it getting the data from, right? Repeatability, you should be able to go back, and auditability should be there in some format and stuff like that. So many principles are there, and when you look at some of the translation of those principles, when you're developing a product, those are very clearly defined as to what should you be doing, how should you be. Then the architects break it down, and companies actually set up certain principles for their architecture and coding, which translates from the high level principles down to exactly what a coder needs to do to be able to work on those systems, right? This is very clear on the software side. Now there is a lot of conversation happening on when you combine hardware and software. What do robots need to do? Do you need to have the three laws of Asimov, or what do you need to do? So I think that's the next level conversation. But at least there is some roadmap to the kind of conversations that need to happen there. I would say that there are some suspect areas also where it's not so clear. But when I look at quantum overall, this area looks a little bit lot more confusing in terms of understanding the principles at a high level, yes, but how do we how do we break it down to the level where people can use it? And maybe the conversation is difficult right now because we are in very early stages of technology. Is that so? What would you say, Clarissa, on this?
It's me, my turn. Okay. I probably will start with a little anecdote because, as I mentioned, in the business school, and one of the courses I teaching there actually is social entrepreneurship. And when teaching a class in social entrepreneurship, one of the things that I do have to teach my students is that how do you translate an idea? Like, how do you go from ideation phase to the implementation phase? And how do you even get to implement something at least at the minimally viable level if you are, for instance, not sure in terms of what resources you would have? to even launch it in the big scale? Like, how are you going to decide on the scalability of the idea that you have? And the idea obviously could be a technology. Well, if you want to go by STS definition of technology, almost everything is actually a technology, right? And then how do you, within the idea is how do you ensure when implementing it that it's actually desirable, it's viable, and it's also feasible? So something that may be technologically feasible may not necessarily be sustainable, which means it's not really viable. And it might also not be desirable. And this actually goes back to the stakeholders again. So the question for it is like, how do you actually fulfill these three criteria when you're actually implementing something that is primarily still at the prototype stage? And for a lot of startups, they tend to work with a lot of prototype level technologies and objects, right? So I would say that there is actually no hard and fast rule to how you actually do the implementation beyond, I think, be able to create a sort of like a strategy that is iterative in nature. And as Zaki said, that's also very participatory as well. So you're not just iterating for yourself, because even like in social entrepreneurship, the other stakeholder is actually the supposed society, the community that's supposed to benefit from the product or the service. And I would say for quantum tech, it's a combination of both. It's a product and it's also a service, because it will sell its products to industries that will actually turn that product into a service that will flow back into the members of the public, which could also include obviously the people who created the products in the first place, right?
Right.
So I would say in terms of implementation itself, is firstly knowing what is desirable in terms of does it actually, for instance, advance justice? Does it actually involves the equity as well and inclusivity in terms of not only some people could access that technology, and then in terms of viability, what does it take to keep it viable? Is it going to be a big sink in terms of financial resources? Who can actually afford that? And I think the
Right.
reason why we have so many different levels of readiness and even difference of roadmaps or even countries with no roadmaps, actually a lot of it goes back to the idea of viability, because a lot of them will start with viability before they even decide whether desirable or
Affordable or not.
feasible,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
At,
All
at
right.
that point in
Yeah.
time. So I would say that the one starting point is actually to consider what is the lowest denominator. Like if you have to implement, if you want to implement quantum technology the next day, right? Where would be the best starting point that is also the most accessible? But of course, you cannot impose this across the board. Obviously, there are some definitely who are already more ready, and there's some who probably had the prototype sitting on the lab for a long time waiting to launch, right? But the thing is, yeah, so it becomes a sort of arm race. And so the question is, when we want to talk about being responsible, does that mean we want to ensure equality? Because that's probably not going to be possible. I'm going to ensure equivalence, because that's also not going to be possible. So then probably the thing will be like to have diversity, right? So certain countries may be able to, or certain regions may be able to implement some parts of the technology better because of their very specific situation, which may not necessarily have anything to do with finances only or
Right,
the
right.
number of
So I think
human resource
if
available.
I'm, I think if we, these are all great points, and I think the conversation is still at the principles level, right? So this
Yeah,
is what I'm saying. I think it's maybe too early to get into, oh, sorry, I don't know how I raised my own. raised my hand. So basically, it is too early to probably have a conversation around
yeah,
on and the use case specific, what is responsible in a specific use case and
yeah,
so on, right? Mohan, any thoughts on that?
I think you exactly said what I was going to say, because unless you have clarity around how you're going to use the technology, you can't think about what the potential impacts are going to be,
Hmm.
right? And one of the challenges I think, and this is what we sort of observe through our studies, is that we talk about a lot of these different sort of potential use cases,
Mm-hmm.
but they aren't actual concrete use cases where organizations or industries are willing to invest today. They're sort of like a wait and see mode in a sense, the end users. And so, unless you have clarity around what these use cases are and how they can impact the different stakeholders
Mm-hmm.
in the ecosystem, I think you can't then sort of go from your values and principles to actual concrete actions. Now, the one thing that can be done, and I think it's sort of, at least in Australia, it's sort of starting to happen, is the different stakeholders starting to talk a bit more seriously about these use cases, and then trying to identify which are the most relevant use cases for a given sector, and what are the sort of the impacts that the technology will have on the different stakeholders. So that's a conversation that's beginning, but again, I think at this stage it's very early.
So I think the next step after a framework could be to actually look at use cases and and the impact. Zeki, yes, please, over to you. I was anyway going to now come to you for your
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I definitely agree with what was said, but also one thing, even though I use like responsible quantum technologies as a cover, like it's not all the same thing. Like computing is different from communication, it's different from sensing. Their timelines are different, their impact areas are different, their implementation plans are different, and their like importance is also different. For example, one thing we noticed is as these quantum sensors become more mature, they basically drop the word quantum in it, and then they just sell it as sensors. Because when you sell something as a quantum sensor, it gives the impression that it is low TRL, it's definitely more expensive than So that, like in terms of this like maturation or the increasing quantum readiness, things might lose their quantum properties and become more classical, let's say. But in terms of use case, I definitely agree. Like, to assess the actual impact, we need actual use cases in the end. And I am not entirely sure whether like general responsible quantum frameworks would apply to all the different use cases in all the different sectors, in all the different technologies. So maybe we need to increase the specificity of our analysis when it comes to that. So like at least for now, I think responsible quantum is more about the ecosystem, because like the ecosystem is the same, but their like implementation of these use cases in different sectors, it will divert quite a bit when TRLs increase and like there is market adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a perfect way to close this discussion and open it up for Q&A, because what we've arrived at is that yes, there's a lot of work happening at from a framework perspective. I think there is a need to now move to the next step, do a little bit of a deep dive, get more specific about it. And of course, we discussed a lot in between, so I'm not going to summarize. In the interest of time, we have around 15 minutes for just 10 minutes for question answers. So, questions from the audience. Anybody wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. Uh, enable your video and please start asking. Any questions?
We were very comprehensive, so like there are no questions.
Or there's a lot to think about for people.
Maybe while the people are thinking about the next question, I just sort of add to the sort of the most recent conversation. It's around, where do we start and how do we sort of operationalize responsible values and principles? And I think this is something that in our discussions, we've been talking about. Okay, it's one thing to have, a framework with high level values and principles, but then unless you can sort of implement that, operationalize that, then the value of the framework gets limited. But then the question is, okay, so you can map these values to actions, but then these actions don't apply equally to all stakeholders.
Right. And so
Right.
we have
So
stakeholder specific application.
yeah. So you got stakeholder specific, and then you've got the sort of the use case specific. So even with stakeholders, they are then sort of they are involved in certain specific use cases, and depending on the use case, your role and your responsibility might change. And so I think we need to sort of look at the use case, the stakeholder involvement in the use case. I think that this is something that we need to sort of think a bit more carefully about. I think while we are sort of developing the framework and sort of going from
This could be
action
the
from
next project.
principles to actions. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually want to point out something about the use cases as well, because we know that this is the International Year of Quantum Science and Tech, and of course, it's coming to an end this month. And because this is the International Year of Quantum Science and Tech, there have been actually a lot of hackathons. I think probably way more than you actually have in total across all the other years when quantum tech
Right.
rose to public consciousness. And it'll be interesting actually to see what happened to all the use cases they were developed. Because the interesting thing about the hackathons is that they actually involve a lot of people who were not originally from the quantum community. When I say quantum community, I also include engineers and computer scientists as well, not just the physicists. So, and obviously because they are from these other groups, right, other with different backgrounds, different expertise, will be like, how would their input to the use cases actually be different than if it were just had been the technical people who were doing it? And obviously, responsible QD also kind of came up a little bit during this year because we were able to host events and also kind of like incorporate it into the other events that are not specific to responsible quantum tech. So yes, I think what is a responsible thing to do actually would be to go and look at all the use cases that were proposed, right, at the varying levels and see what can actually be done with those, as opposed to reinventing the wheel again and again.
Right. I totally agree with you on that. Sure. Any last thoughts? Because there seem to be no other questions. Any last thoughts? If not, then I would wrap this up by saying that it was, I think, thank you everyone. Thank you to the panelists. This was a very, very insightful discussion. And for once, it was very insightful, I believe, for all of us as well, because of the different viewpoints that came in from the panel itself. And I hope it was insightful and useful to all the participants. I'm sure it is. And one way to let you know, it would be great, since there are no questions coming this time, do let us know what you want to, some reminder is there. So what you want, from us in the future for quantum pulse sessions. How did you find this session? Would you be interested in going in more detail? If you have any questions which come up in your mind after the discussion as you're mulling over it, or if you're watching this the recording, please come back to us. Thank you so much. This was a great discussion.
Thank you.
A lot of learning, I'm sure, for everyone. And thank you for the audience for definitely, this is such a topic that all the people who are here are deeply interested in the topic. That's why they are here. And hence there's a smaller number, but more quality. Thank you very much. All right. Bye.